morning, good afternoon, good evening, students, whenever you are watching this. In today's video, I'll be going over some of the things in Unit 5 regarding the government budget, namely the idea of a government budget deficit and a budget surplus, how that happens, and a bunch of real-world stuff on how that's affecting us and what we're doing with it, as both at a government and an individual level, what kind of things are affecting that. Additionally, we will hit on one big point of emphasis for the AP exam, which is the idea of crowding out. Now, this crowding out thing will have to do with our loanable funds market graph, as well as our aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. So have those ready in the chamber of your brain later on in the PowerPoint. I'm going to end with that so that I can spend the most time kind of covering that concept, because that's the one that practically gets asked about the most. Whereas the rest of this content is useful information for you in the real world, like to know what the government's doing and how their choices affect us. But the AP exam is going to ask a lot about crowding out. So there's your sort of example. But with that all out of the way, let's get into it. So, there we go. The federal budget, debt and deficit, and then crowding out at the very end. So, first things first, the federal budget. When we're talking about the budget and the U.S.'s budget, we're talking about the spending and revenue of the U.S. government. So the money that the government spends and the money that the government brings in. And most of the money that the government brings in, you guys are pretty aware of this, comes in the form of taxes. Now, there are other methods to do this too. We mentioned things like bonds in last unit as a way for the government to sort of crowdfund things and try to make a little bit of money on the side so they can afford to produce a little bit more spending in the economy. Sorry, I was trying to open up the pen thing because I always forget to open up the pen. There it is. The basic idea for the budget is the revenue is composed primarily of tax revenue, money made from the government off of taxes. The government then uses that money to pay for everything that they might provide. In America, that includes things like defense, education, things like Medicare and Medicaid, stuff like that. Now, there are proposals to add things to this. Think of like clean energy initiatives like the Green New Deal that's been talked about by some people on the Democrat side recently as a move for this, or socialized healthcare from people like Bernie Sanders, things like them, which would be adding more on to this sort of bill. Conversely, when you change tax revenue, changing tax plan like President Trump did back in 2016, where he lowered taxes kind of across the board for everybody, most heavily on the wealthy, but it was a tax cut for everyone, that lowers the tax revenue. So here is sort of the equation to have in mind as we're thinking of the federal budget, that you want revenue to equal spending. You want this is a terrible place to put this actually, let me try and write it somewhere else. You want your tax revenue to equal your government spending. Remember that G is government spending, TR here is just tax revenue. That's kind of the idea. That equation is not true for us most of the time. It needs to be mentioned that this is the reason why the government has added on a lot of debt, because if the government is planning on spending more than they have in tax revenue, basically if the government is instead gonna have a situation like this, where your tax revenue is less than your government spending. If this thing is true, the government will have to borrow money. Now, they can borrow from a lot of different entities. The thing that comes up the most is like we borrow a lot of money from China. That is kind of hyperbolic. We do borrow more from China than from any other country, and I believe we borrow more from China than any other individual lender, but we have $22 trillion of debt, and only about 1 to 2 of it is directly to China. There are other ways that China might have holdings of our debt, but like directly to China debt, it's only like $1 to $2 trillion, depending on what measure we're looking at. So it's not like they have half of our debt or anything. They have a bunch of other things that sort of make up a larger percentage of it that's kind of complicated. But just like straight on direct debt that we have directly borrowed from China, we're in the $1 to $2 trillion out of our $22 trillion of debt range with that. So we might borrow from other countries. We might borrow from the private sector like people. We can do that. That's the bond thing we mentioned. And from banks. The government can take out a loan from a bank the same way that the bank can take out a loan from the Fed. Like, it can go both ways. So that's sort of the idea. And again, this is the equation to kind of have in mind when you're thinking budget deficit and budget surplus, which let's explain what those things are. So, deficit and debt. This is a thing that the news, I think, messes up quite a bit. So a deficit, which is what we'll be talking about most of the time in this class, is the amount by which government spending exceeds revenue. Basically, again, if I mentioned like the last slide, if this equation is what's happening, if your government spending exceeds your tax revenue, you are in a deficit. And the deficit amount is how large this gap is. How much greater is government spending than tax revenue? For example, if we had $3 trillion of government spending and $2 trillion of tax revenue, we'd have a deficit of $1 trillion. We'd be $1 trillion in the red, is a way to think about it. Now, the debt, when we talk about the government's debt, this is not annual, this is total. The deficit is an annual thing. So you'd see like the deficit for this year is $1 trillion. That means this year we were $1 trillion in the red. We have added $1 trillion of debt to our overall debt amount. So the public debt is the total accumulation. This was as of 2018. We had 21.21 trillion at the end of June. At the end of 2019, we were at roughly 23 trillion, and it could go up quite a bit this year, depending on the COVID plans and things like that, because the government has spent quite a bit more money than normal this year, and tax revenue has gone down significantly. So here's where our debt looks like. U.S. investors actually have the largest portion of it. So this is private people and banks in the United States. The government can borrow from the Federal Reserve. Remember, the Federal Reserve is not technically a part of the government. They are kind of like the bank's bank. They're its own separate institution. It does have a connection to the government, but it isn't technically a part of it. So we do borrow a decent amount from the Federal Reserve. We borrow from ourselves. I'll get into that in a second. That's a real weird thing. And we borrow from foreign investors, namely China is the most heavily influenced in that group. But still the largest is actually domestic. Now, this is where this weird number comes in, because this is always one that stands out to me when I'm looking. I'm like, what the hell? We owe what the government owes 27% of its debt to itself? How does that work? So here's the tricky part. When doing things like budget alignment, the budgets are separate for each different department. Like Department of Education, you guys might have like 600 billion. Department of Defense, you guys might have 3 trillion. Things like that. So sometimes it's like a specific department that goes over budget, and other departments are not over budget. So what they might do is, and this is going to sound stupid, but they might loan out that money to another department. Be like, hey, we've got enough left over that we could chip some your way. You just pay us back over time. Problem is, those departments typically run in the red because they kind of will run in the red all of the time and are going to accumulate debt relatively quickly. So sometimes this misallocation of budget, the idea that we might be putting a little bit too much in specific things and not enough in other things, leads to us owing some money to ourselves. That is weird, and yes, we could forgive that debt relatively easily. So like from the standpoint of this number, does it affect me and you? Not a whole lot, it's just kind of weird. They don't want to forgive it because that would require both sides to forgive it, and it's not like if the Department of Education borrowed from the Department of Defense, the Department of Defense would be like, yeah, it's fine, don't worry about it. They're like, no, you owe us money, dog. You owe us money. You're going to pay it back, eventually. That's the idea. The rest of the debt, which is still the majority of it, again, we're talking like a quarter of it, roughly, is to itself. The rest of it is to other groups, mostly U.S. investors, a good chunk foreign investors, a smaller chunk Federal Reserve. Now, it should be mentioned that that foreign part has been growing. It's gotten substantially bigger. 50% is owned by the public, both us and international, and about half of that is held by Asian countries. Correct. About 60% of our debt is owned by investors, and a good chunk of it is held by other countries, namely Asian countries make up the largest chunk of this. The two biggest ones are Japan and China, but this, all in this red area, are Asian countries. So we're talking lots of countries that have, and part of these other countries. Lots of it is owned by Asian countries. So why are they doing this? Why are other countries, namely Asian ones, going after it? The reason why China's been doing it is something that is being brought up a handful of times in the past decade of, it seems like they are using our currency in international transactions. What I mean by that is, a typical step when you're making an international transaction is to have to convert currencies. Like, say if we buy a bunch of stuff from China, we give China a bunch of US dollars that need to get converted into the Chinese yen or renminbi, or the RMB, which is their currency. Okay. They have to convert that because otherwise it's not usable in their economy, right? So like when Japan buys stuff from us, we get a bunch of yen that we need to convert to dollars, that whole step, right? China, it would appear, this is like, allegedly, has not been converting the dollars. And you're like, well, why? They can't use that. It's like, but if they keep them in dollars and they use dollars instead in these international transactions, their currency doesn't get affected at all, and our currency does. The idea being they substitute our currency in some international transactions because that will affect the value of the dollar and not the value of the yuan, which is their currency. The reason why they would want to do that is the more your goods get demanded, the more valuable your currency becomes, which sounds good, but the problem with that is that if your currency becomes very, very valuable and very, very in demand, then your goods get very expensive. Because if your currency is high demanded, it's going to have a high value. It's going to take a lot more of other currencies to get your currency. So like it'll take more pounds to get $1. That's the idea. Which is great for people in America because they can buy things from other countries. But it's not great for American companies that want to sell their goods to like Britain, in that example, right? So if China uses our currency instead, it keeps their currency's value stable and at the low level that it is. They want that because they want Chinese goods to stay cheap. They want Chinese goods to stay affordable for a lot of people because if they stay affordable, we'll keep buying them. The reason why Chinese goods have stayed so cheap, even though we've been buying them consistently for like 20 years, is that they've been using our currency quite a bit instead. So that's part of the reason why China wants to have a lot of U.S. debt, is that whenever we're paying off that debt, guess what currency we're using to pay off that debt? U.S. dollars, because it's the currency we've got. But they are hoarding U.S. dollars and using those instead in international transactions to keep the value of their currency low. That's the idea. It's kind of complicated. That's not an AP exam question. That's just a like, real world, this is what China's doing in case you wanted to know. Learning something. Okay. Now that's all deficit and debt. Let's talk about the opposite. The surplus. This is a good thing, potentially. So if your tax revenue exceeds government spending, so if we had this equation be accurate, if tax revenue was greater than government spending, we would be in a budgetary surplus. We would have leftover money. It's pretty good. You can invest that. You could spend that if you want to as the government. You could save it and just hold on to it in case you go into a deficit. You can pay back more of your debt if you're in a surplus. This is an annual thing. So you might be in a surplus in 1 year, but still have total debt. You were in the green for that year, but still some total you're in the red. So the last time we had a budgetary surplus was back in 2000. It was $236.4 billion. It's solid. Reasoning for that is that back in the late 90s to early 2000s, we weren't in any armed international conflict, which would lead to a lot of government spending on military, so we weren't having to worry about that. For really the only time in American history, Clinton was able to successfully raise taxes and not piss off everybody. I mean, it made some people generally upset, but it didn't, cause riots in the streets that you might think would happen if taxes got raised now. So we had higher taxes, less government spending. That gets to this equation being true. So we had that happen. But after President Bush took office, one, he campaigned on undoing those tax raises that Clinton had done because even though people were generally okay with it, people do like having more money than less. So campaigning on lowering taxes is kind of a thing you can literally always do, and people will vote for it. We also had a recession back in early 2001. Not a huge one, but a blip. It was the dot-com crash. So not as terrible as 2009 and today's recessions. And, a war in the Middle East breaks out in 2001. So we end up spending a whole bunch on improving security, national security, things like homeland security, as well as arming ourselves to go fight overseas and flying us over there and building a bunch more jets and all that stuff. So by 2003, we had a deficit of about $400 billion. So we had gone, over the course of 4 years, a negative $600 billion swing is the idea. So you're like, oh, wow, this can change pretty quickly. Yes, it can even stack more because in 2020, this year, the deficit is projected to grow as high as $4.275 trillion. For reference, the last couple of years, we've kept it under $1 trillion. Which is pretty good for us. It's gone up the last few years a little bit here and there. That's mostly due to Trump's lowering of taxes, right? Trump's tax plan lowers taxes. Okay, that's going to hurt your tax revenue. So the deficit was growing under President Trump. But with 2020, namely due to the COVID pandemic, where there is a bunch of government spending on things like unemployment benefits, on the COVID relief bill. I mean, that was multiple $1 trillion bill instantaneously. That was just like, boom, multiple $1 trillion government spending. We'll probably have to do another one of those stimulus bills. Things like that. The deficit ballooned like crazy this year to 4.275 trillion. Massive, massive amount of debt for this year. Makes sense. It's logically, it's like, yeah, okay, I see why this would happen this year. It's just like, be aware, this is a crazy high number for us. Again, our normal numbers are like, if it's 1 trillion, between 0.5 and 1.5 trillion is like our normal baseline the past decade or so. 4.275 is kind of massive. But again, that's largely due to COVID, which is kind of a not normal thing for us. A pandemic isn't like a routine thing for America. Okay, now, reason why these budget deficits and surpluses matter for the sake of this course as well as for the sake of reality is that they really mess with the effectiveness of things like fiscal policy. This changes the equation when we're talking about stuff like, hey, if we're in a recession, what should we do? The government should spend more. It's like, okay, but what if they're in a deficit? If the government's spending more but it has to borrow to spend, is that actually good for us? Are we helping ourselves get out of the recession, or are we creating a different problem? Like, that's the kind of thing we want to be thinking about real world. It's like, okay, cool. Because it sounds like in the last couple units, it's easy to fix these problems. It's like, okay, we're in a recession, push the button to spend more, or push the button to lower taxes. We're in an inflationary period, okay, you better raise those taxes, you better cut that spending. Boom, bang, boom, we fix the economy, we've mastered economics, America can have no economic problems. That's not how it works. So there's some problems we want to talk about. So, the big one with this is deficit spending. Oh, come on, highlighter. This is why I have to... Okay, will this highlight color work? Yes. Okay, so yellow it hates. All right. So if the government increases spending without increasing taxes, they will increase the deficit. Again, if the government's increasing spending without increasing taxes, basically they're spending more money, but they don't have that money to spend, they're going to rack up some debt. Now, this is seen as a necessary evil for the most part because trying to force a balanced budget would not really allow for the economy to be stimulating, because balancing the budget would effectively be a contractionary policy for us, because we're so often in the red that if we wanted to get back to the green, our methods are raising taxes and lowering government spending. Those are contractionary policies, and those might not be appropriate. Like, especially right now, like, we're in a recession. We should not be raising taxes a lot or cutting government spending. Those are not things we should be doing, unless we're like cutting it, using the taxes in a very specific way, right? Like, you have to be very careful with how you do those buttons right now, because we're in a recession. Now, here's how this debt looks over time if you're trying to get an idea. Now, this doesn't account for Trump and really Obama's second term, but I can give you the visual for it by moving my camera and just drawing it. For Obama, it kept going like this, and for Trump, it kept going like this. So that's sort of how, and then like this here, it's just like broke through the top of the thing. So it's just been going up. The idea being is that outside of this window right here with Clinton near the end of his term back in 2000, see, that's why we mentioned that we went into a surplus, we really have seen our debt grow consistently since Vietnam. That's the thing. Like, us having a deficit is the normal thing. Running a deficit is the normal thing. So, like, in this presidential election, we had some talk, not a ton. This year, we were a little bit more calm about it. But a typical talking point in our presidential debates usually would be, we need to balance the budget. We need to stop running deficits. It's like, okay, but if we've been in a deficit basically every year since 1960, that's a pretty unrealistic expectation to have for a president. Like, you think the president's going to fix the budget, you're voting for the wrong thing. Like, it's not a realistic proposition. We're going to be in a deficit. It doesn't mean we can't try and get it smaller. That should be a good goal, is to try and, like, lessen our deficits over time. That's a good idea. We're like, make the deficits a little bit smaller over time. That's generally a nice thought for us. But we've had our debt go up pretty consistently for the last 60 years. It's how you get to like $22, $23 trillion of debt. It's not in one day. That's an insane amount of money. That takes a lot of time to accumulate. Now, another problem, what I consider to be kind of a bigger societal problem, is this reverse Robin Hood effect that happens. So we mentioned that a majority of our debt, the largest chunk, well, plurality, but the largest chunk of our debt is owed to individual investors in the United States, right? Well, how do you pay that debt? You pay it through tax revenue. So it's the same way that we use our spending as that we pay for our debt. We actually do make consistent payments towards our debt. It's almost always like 300 to 400 billion of our budget is set aside to just make interest payments on our debt. It's not even kidding. Now here's the problem with that. You're collecting tax revenue from everybody, right? You're taking money from everyone across all incomes. That's how taxes work. And you're paying it back to the people that own the debt. Well, here's the tricky part. Who owns the debt? Rich people, generally. People who could afford to buy these bonds, and banks and lending institutions. Basically, we collect money from everybody and we give it to people who already have enough to have given it to the government in the first place so that they can then repeat the cycle. Effectively, there is money being kind of consistently siphoned from the lower classes' tax input and being given back to wealthier people. So that's why I call it a reverse Robin Hood, because Robin Hood stole from the rich and gave to the poor. This is effectively taking money from the poor and giving it back to the upper class. Because this is a money-making method. It is a good way to make money because the government does pay its debt eventually. They pay consistently, and it's nice to have the government owe you money. But it's not something that poor people can really afford to do. They're busy, buying food and shelter. But rich people who have like 2 homes could afford to lend some money to the government and then rack up some interest payments. Now, additionally, this is always a good question to bring up because someone always asks this question. And usually it's just for like devil's advocate, which is, Mr. Mickrich, what happens if we just don't pay the debt? What if we just say, like, screw it, we're not going to pay it? Like, we're just not going to pay the debt. What happens? Well, this gets really awkward. So, in case you are not aware, countries do have credit scores. Yeah, the same way that me and you do, where like we get loans and based on our credit we can get a better interest rate and stuff like that. Countries have credit scores too. The better they are at paying their debts, the lower their credit score, or the higher their credit score, meaning the lower the cost of future loans will be. It makes it more affordable for them to borrow. Well, if you have really bad credit, it makes it really hard for you to borrow. And if you're a country that doesn't pay back its debt, like if we decided, hey, let's just not pay it, let's just say, screw them, we're done, we're not going to pay back our debt, we won't be able to borrow from anyone. No one will trust us. Not other countries, not people within our borders. Rich people who had been lending money to the government will not want to lend money to the government anymore, which means the government will be forced to run surpluses. They will not have the flexibility of, say we're in a time like right now of COVID where we're going to run a deficit. That's fine. You kind of need to. We need to do a lot of government stimulus packages and at least not change taxes, and if we're going to change them, ideally maybe lower them a little bit. If we're going to raise them, you got to be crazy specific on how you're doing that and create lots of avenues for those to still get lowered back down. Like, you want as much spending as possible right now, and you don't really care about the budget right now. Well, great, but if you can't borrow from anybody because you have no credit, because you've decided to not pay back your debt, no one's going to lend you money, the government is forced to run a surplus, otherwise they will just not be able to do things. So the government will have to raise taxes and cut spending. That means a weaker military. That means less money in education. That means less money towards healthcare. It means if you were hoping to have them pay for college at some point, not happening. Less money for grants and scholarships as well. Less money for all that stuff. And higher taxes just because we can't pay our debt. Or at least we can't even acquire debt because no one trusts us anymore. So if anyone, and I'm telling you this directly, if anyone tells you we should just not pay back our debt, ask them what happens if they don't pay back any of their debt. If they bought a house with a mortgage and then don't pay it back, what happens? That property goes away. It gets seized. Your life gets worse. It's why you pay back your debts. It's how debt works. So that's not a real option. That is a option held by people who choose to be ignorant of things that it takes 5 minutes to explain why that's stupid. Okay, additional problems with fiscal policy. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but it's still an important one because boy howdy do I see it happen enough times that I need to correct it. So, with fiscal policy, there are additional problems we've got to be aware of. One is timing. We mentioned things like, hey, we're in a recession, so the government will spend more. You guys should be aware of this by now with the COVID pandemic. It takes time for the government to do things. First problem is Congress has to react to an issue before it's too late. The stimulus bill that was signed into play in late March, early April. We'd been in the midst of the COVID pandemic for at least 2 weeks at that point. That's about as fast as it could have gone for them to have actually done a thing, because it takes time for them to realize. Luckily, the COVID pandemic was such a sort of on its face obvious issue because it was a health pandemic, that Congress was able to notice it very early. A lot of economic issues, it takes a while to figure out. Like the stuff back in 2008 with the housing crisis, people have been sort of like raising their hand about indicators there for like 2 years of like, guys, this is not gonna go well. We're gonna hit a massive bubble and things are gonna go real bad. And Congress is like, it hasn't happened yet. We don't have to do anything yet. We don't know. We can't tell. And it's like, no, we can sort of tell. And they're like, nah, we can't tell because it hadn't happened. COVID, it's like, boom, it's happening. It's like, oh, shoot. All right, we'll do something. It also takes time to pass legislation. This is the problem we're facing right now for the last, 4 months, which is we probably need another stimulus bill. Like, I'm pretty sure everyone on both sides is like, yeah, we probably need another bill. But it takes time for Congress to pass legislation because they've got to, negotiate. They've got to actually come to an agreement. And that's the problem we've had for the last few months, is that the Democrats, Republicans, and President Trump are not aligned on how they want to do the spending. The Democrats want to make sure that individual people are getting more benefit. The Republicans want to make sure that businesses are being held more afloat and being helped. And President Trump doesn't want to do anything the Democrats want to do. And since the Democrats have the majority in the House, it's making things very difficult. And we haven't even gotten to the part where operational lag could happen, which is the idea that even though we say we're going to spend this money on these blank things, it doesn't happen instantaneously. It takes time. It's like, okay, we're going to increase spending on healthcare by $800 billion. It's like, okay, do we just transfer money to healthcare instantaneously, or do we have to find things to spend that money on, find people to hire with that money, etc.? That takes time. It takes time to get the operations done. It's why changing taxes is quicker. A tax change is an immediate change. It's not as impactful because the multiplier effect is stronger with spending. But it is fast because it would get impacted the next paycheck. So the first issue is timing. I mentioned there's a lot of problems with that, just how our government is structured. This is generally meant to be a good thing. It's supposed to take time for legislation to pass so that Congress can't do anything too crazy too quickly or do anything too dumb too fast. It's just when you need something fast, there isn't a fast track. There isn't a fast pass or anything for our legislation. The second issue is politics, which I already kind of mentioned on administrative lag, but this is a more important one, which is politicians are not always up on the forefront of what is the most economically appropriate policy. I mentioned this with President Trump and with President Bush, and I could kind of make this sort of a observation about Republican presidents in general. This is not a criticism of the Republican Party. This is just their party platform is lower taxes. They want lower taxes. That's cool. And lower taxes is nice if you need lower taxes. The problem is there are plenty of times in our economy where we don't need to lower taxes any more than we already have. I would make the argument, and economists did back in 2016, that when Trump passed his tax plan, it's like, okay, yeah, you can do this. I know you campaigned on it, but we're not in a recession. We were pretty much at full employment whenever he was elected into office. We had gotten sort of back to where we wanted to be by the end of Obama's term. After recovering from the recession, we kind of got back to an even playing field is a good way to think about it. And then Trump's like, okay, we're going the speed limit. Let's start speeding again. It's like, okay. You kind of could have stood pat for a bit and then waited to see how things turned out. And if you needed to cut taxes, you could. If you needed to raise taxes, you could. It kind of removes some flexibility when you do that. Because once he cuts those taxes, it's not like he can raise them. Because he campaigned on lowering them. He did lower them. Then he would just go back on his word. That isn't a thing you can really do. So they might they might use economically inappropriate policies to get reelected. And again, here the most obvious thing is expansionary policies, because expansionary policies are the popular ones, right? Lowering taxes or increasing government spending in large surges. This would be on things like healthcare and education are the ones the Democrats sort of campaign for a lot right now, where it's let's get Medicare for all, socialized healthcare, or free college tuition. Those things are massive increases in government spending. In 2020, those actually make more sense economically because we are in a recession and doing those things is appropriate. Similarly, Trump could have ran on a platform of increasing government spending, which he kind of did when it came to relief programs and military. He just didn't say it as, I think, clearly as the Democrats were campaigning for like active new spending ventures. I don't think Trump did as good of a job of advocating for the spending part. And this is sort of an example of it. Now, the big problem with fiscal policy, and this is the key thing for today's lecture, so if you've been falling asleep because I've been talking about the real world for too much and you really hate when I talk about things that matter, if you've been really bored, here's the time to focus up. The big problem with all of this is the crowding out effect. Let me move myself over here. The crowding out effect, wherein government spending or tax revenue, this is government policy, but generally it's spending, might cause unintended effects that weaken the impact of the policy. Basically, an expansionary policy meant to help our economy might not help the economy as much as the government's wanting to. Namely, or main reason here, is the government may crowd out consumers, sort of block them out from the loanable funds market if they borrow in a deficit. That should say they, that is a typo. If they borrow whilst in a deficit. So let's sort of explain that, and I'm going to draw it on a graph and show you after, but here's sort of the verbiage of it. So example, let's say they're in a recessionary gap and the government wants to increase spending to get back to full employment. That is the classic move. That is what we are in the midst of right now with all these COVID relief bill suggestions. Cool. The government increases spending, AD goes up, right? Government spending goes up, aggregate demand goes up, gets back to full employment. That's sort of how we've always been talking about it. But they're in a deficit. So how is the government going to go about doing the spending? Well, if the government's in a deficit, they're going to have to borrow to spend more, right? Because they don't have the money to spend. So if they do that, if the government is borrowing more, interest rates are going to start to go up. If you think our loanable funds market graph, this would be because the demand for loanable funds is going up. There is a larger emphasis on borrowing because the government is wanting to borrow more. Okay. So the interest rate will start to rise, and we've mentioned in the last unit that interest rates and investment spending are inversely related because if interest rates go up, it becomes more expensive to borrow. So businesses and people will borrow and spend less. That decreases AD. Remember, the goal of the policy was to get us out of a recession, to have AD increase. But an unintended consequence of this borrowing and spending could actually mitigate that. So let me draw it for you. I'm going to need to pan to actually just me. That's weird. Yeah, let's go. Is this one? That's the one I want. Okay. I'm going to be drawing this. If you want to draw along, what you're going to want to draw is two graphs, an aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph in a recessionary gap, and then a loanable funds market graph. We're going to want to have these two graphs drawn. An aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph in a recessionary gap. I'm just sketching out right now. I'm going to abbreviate some stuff on my axes to make it fit on my tiny baby whiteboard relatively easily. And a loanable funds market graph. Okay. All right. Got it drawn. So, cool. Yeah, you can see that pretty easily. So here is my aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph in a recessionary gap. Again, this is a recession because my current level of production, which is indicated by YE, is less than my full employment level of production, represented by my LRAS curve. Okay. So we said at the very beginning of this thing that the government is going to increase spending to get us back to full employment. So the idea is they're going to do this. This is sort of the goal. That blue marker kind of sucks. Or does it? I can't tell. But this is sort of the goal. Is to increase aggregate demand to get us back to full employment. But they're in a deficit. They're going to have to borrow to spend. So if there's borrowing involved, if I'm thinking of borrowing and lending, I know a graph for that. Loanable funds market graph. Real interest rate is my y-axis. I'm trying to point, but it's too far over there. You can't see it because I had to squeeze it really in. That's quantity of loans. It's QL. That's demand of loans and supply of loans. So, government's borrowing more. Okay? So the government is borrowing more. You could either think of this as they want more loans or they're taking away loans from other people. So technically speaking, you can draw crowding out two ways. You can draw it with an increase in demand for loans or a decrease in supply. I like doing the demand thing because it allows me to be a little bit more consistent with my interpretation. But if you see another video on the internet where they say it like you decrease supply, don't be thrown off by that. That's fine also. They're both correct. So this is crowding out visualized on my loanable funds market graph. To be clear, on the AP exam, you need to know what it looks like for both of these. But they will mostly frame it around this graph right here, my loanable funds market graph. So there's crowding out. The government is borrowing more. There's a greater demand for loans. This is how this stuff impacts me and you. In case you're wondering, like, how the hell does this like government debt thing affect me and you? Cool. Remember that y-axis over here? Real interest rate, what happened to it? Went from there to there. Interest rates are higher. Reminder, interest rates are the price of borrowing, the price of loans. And if they're borrowing from the same places we can borrow, which remember, 36% of it is from private investors, that it could include banks in our economy. If they're borrowing from the same people we borrow from, then the price of our borrowing goes up too. That means getting a loan to buy a house, to buy a car, to go to college, all become more expensive if the government borrows from the same institutions we borrow from, which they do. Quite a lot, actually. This is the danger of the deficit, the debt thing, is that it makes loans more expensive for people like me and you. It's also why the government tries to borrow from other countries. It's not a bad idea for us to borrow from China and from Japan, because if we borrow from outside of our borders, then we don't actually raise interest rates here, because we're not borrowing from the same groups that Americans do. It's also why they borrow from private individuals a lot of the time. That's why the bond thing is such a good idea for them. Because if they issue out bonds, they're not taking money away from like lending institutions necessarily. Especially if they sell those bonds to specifically very wealthy individuals. Like they are limiting it a little bit, but not as bad as it by directly borrowing from a bank, if that makes sense. So the idea here is the government tries to work around this, but the problem with them being in a deficit is this crowding out thing. This is the issue with the deficit, because if this demand for loans things happens, interest rates go up, on this graph what would happen is that shift to AD1 might not happen. It might be more of something like this. Where we get to this other smaller blue line. There's still an increase in aggregate demand because the government did increase spending by a lot, and spending is going to go up in general overall in our economy. But not by as much as the government thinks, meaning it might not close the recessionary gap. We might not get out of the recession. That's not good. That's a bad thing. So when they do stuff like this, be very careful. It's also why the government likes to issue out loans themselves for things like student loans. Because that way, if they're the ones issuing out the loans, even though they can kind of borrow from themselves, it's a much easier way for them to control the price of that student loan. Because like, if it really affected student loans a ton, like the price of them, it would be even more unaffordable to go to college, which it already is pretty unaffordable, but it would be even more so if they were like, if the government didn't lend money, period. It's why the government like issues out student loans, because they know that they can control the price of that a little bit easier than asking banks to when they're taking money from the banks for themselves. Right. So those are kind of things to be aware of here. This is a sort of distressing PowerPoint in terms of this is telling you about a real world thing that is, frankly, pretty scary. Because this is explaining, like, when the government's in debt, it does affect you. No one ever wants to explain it because then they have to come to the conclusion of, wait, does that mean we should fix the deficit? And the answer is, yeah, we should slow it. At least trim it. Like, don't have as much of a deficit as we normally do. If we could keep it in the, like, billions, that would be great. Because at least at that point, we can afford to pay it somewhat reasonably. But when the difference between, like, $200 billion of debt and $2 trillion of debt is a ton. It's 10 times the amount. So we'd want to keep it closer to that 200 billion range if we can, which means we'd have to put in things like higher taxes and less government spending on stuff. Again, the majority of our spending is on military, so things like getting us out of armed conflicts is financially pretty good, actually, for balancing our budget. People say like wars help our economy. They help us spend more, but if we're trying to cut back on government spending, then we probably don't need to be in wars. Or at least it shouldn't be in wars. It doesn't help us there. So economically speaking, it would be appropriate for us to scale back international conflicts, scale back our military spending, raise taxes kind of across the board on just about everybody, especially people who could afford it. That's why you see Democrats trying to raise taxes on the rich a lot. Part of that's to pay for the things they want to do, but at least at least they're trying to kind of pay for things, right? It's the idea of like, if you want to lower taxes and increase spending, you got to be careful because you're just advertising borrowing. If you lower taxes and spending, okay, you're letting it pay for itself. If you're raising taxes and raising spending, okay, you're letting it pay for itself. But if there's a conflict there and you're creating a deficit in your policy, that's bad, and you should kind of get talked at for that. You should be yelled at for that and get criticized. Okay. I think that's just about it for this PowerPoint. Yeah, that is. So that's it for the federal budget and crowding out. Again, the big thing to take away is that you have a budget surplus and you have a budget deficit. The deficit occurs if your tax revenue is less than government spending it. If you don't have enough money to spend, right? When the government increases spending in those time periods, it can cause crowding out because it will cause loans to get more expensive for everybody, hurting everyone else's ability to spend, which would mitigate how effective a fiscal policy can be. This also gets down to one big key difference, and this is something to write down. The difference between expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy are both meant to increase spending on our economy. That's kind of the goal. Expansionary monetary policy does so by increasing the money supply, lowering interest rates, increasing borrowing and spending, right? That's how it worked in the last unit. So when you do expansionary monetary policy, you will end up with lower interest rates. But if you do expansionary fiscal policy whilst in a deficit, which matters, if you do expansionary fiscal policy in a deficit, you're going to end up with higher interest rates because of crowding out. That is a key difference where they ask like, okay, expansionary fiscal policy would do what? Expansionary monetary policy would do what? You're like, the same. It's like, no, there is one big difference. And that is interest rates will go different ways depending on the policy. If it's monetary, interest rates will go down. If it's fiscal, because of crowding out, the interest rates will actually start to climb if the government has to borrow more. So there's more of like a negative effect that can happen when you do fiscal policy as opposed to monetary when you're in a deficit. That needs to be emphasized. When you're in a deficit, you'll have questions that say like, assume the budget is balanced, or assume that in the absence of crowding out. Things like that. They'll say things like, hey, don't worry about crowding out. But if they don't say don't worry about crowding out, you should be thinking like, wait a minute. If this is America, they're in debt kind of all the time. Expansionary fiscal policy is probably going to start causing some higher interest rates because of borrowing. So yeah, careful for that. But that's it for today's video. The next video I'm going to be doing is over the Phillips curve, so stay tuned for that. But thank you guys for watching as always, and have a great day.